Grab yourself a kayak or pontoon or just your tackle box. We're heading down to the lake, where folks love to fish love to swim, and nightmares love to rise from the water to ruin everyone's day. These are allegedly true scary stories about disturbing things seen at lakes. Now, let's begin. I've always been fond of nature. Ever since I was young, we were constantly moving from city to city, but in every location, I would find the nearest nature trail or overgrown abandoned property and frequent the place as often as I could. At one point, my house was only a few blocks from a very extensive mountain range in New Mexico. This made it all the more saddening when we moved to western Oklahoma, where almost all property is private and national parks are few and far between. The closest hiking trail to my mother and father's house was the Red Rock Canyon in Hinton, almost 20 miles away, a bit far when you don't have a driver's license and everyone's too busy to drive you there. Fast forward to a few years later. I live on my own in Oklahoma City now and work as a forklift driver. The urge to engulf myself in wilderness persists, but I'm surrounded on all sides by asphalt and metro, save for a few city parks here and there. My only salvation lies in Lake Thunderbird. Anybody from Oklahoma could tell you that Lake Thunderbird is a large national park just south of Norman, with plenty of room for fishing, camping, hiking, mountain biking, and horseback riding. The lake even comes complete with its own sketchy tackle shops and redneck landowners. However, Lake Thunderbird is about 50 miles from my apartment in the city, so the visits are rare. Sadly, my last visit will probably be my final trip down there. I had eaten a large meal to gather energy for the hike. I parked my car on the usual spot, grabbing my walking stick and leaving my phone in the console. I had done this almost every time I hiked to immerse myself and disconnect from technology. Only now do I realize how bad of an idea that was. I had taken the southernmost trail, a very long one that skirted the southern border of the park around to the eastern side. I had never actually used this trail and was kind of in an exploring mood. The first part of the hike was extremely serene. It was a winding trail that led through thick brush and forest across multiple creeks and past multiple herds of deer that seemed to not even fear my presence until I got within 20 yards. However, that serenity was short-lived. As I topped a hill and happened upon what most would call a grisly sight, a femur here, a rib there. For a small fraction of the trail, a mass of bones were scattered around. Given their size, anyone who hadn't hunted deer before may have mistaken some of the bones to be human. Seeing as how I had grown up in a family of hunters my whole life, this sight didn't so much frighten me as it caught me off guard. In fact, deer bones were practically common chew toys for dogs in our house. What I found unnerving, however, was the fact that the spinal cord and jawbone of the animal had been lodged in two trees parallel to each other on the trail. I had seen something like this before in New Mexico. Coyotes were a growing threat to cattle owners, so hunters would hang the bodies of killed coyotes on fence posts at the edge of cattle ranches, kind of like a barbaric pest deterrent. But that logic made no sense here. In my mind, I rationalized that some teenagers had probably found a long-deceased deer skeleton and decided to try and spook some hikers. I kept going, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't bothered. For the next mile or so, the trail only seemed to get worse. Vegetation had overtaken the pathway, and one bridge was in severe disrepair. I had not seen another hiker or rider in a few hours. Eventually, I came upon a fork. The left trail, even in its unkempt state, was far less wild, but the idea of discovering new places excited me and clouded my judgment. I went right, and I very quickly came upon a barbed wire fence that had been cut. I hadn't put two and two together at the moment, but I had just crossed out of the park. Almost immediately, the density of the forest tripled. The canopy seemed to swallow the area and darkness. One thing I noted was that insects in the area were particularly thick. I was constantly swatting at flies buzzing around me. After what had to have been about 30 to 40 minutes of trekking, I started to hear a rhythmic sound in the distance. The metallic grinding of steel on dirt and rock, followed by the sound of dirt falling on dirt. No mistaking it, someone nearby was digging. I don't know if it was that I'd finally realized the oddity of the situation. Or I just didn't want to disturb whoever was digging, but I elected to avoid the direction of that sound. I went further into the brush to follow the trail from the side. There wasn't much of a trail to follow anymore anyway. As I passed the direction of the sound at a great distance, I got just a glimpse of the digger. How far away I was, I couldn't see any details, but I could see that they were wearing an old torn coat and a black flop hat with long black curly hair cascading from beneath. I remember remarking to myself how sinister the spectacle was, but told myself that he was probably just a camper snuffing out a fire, and I kept on moving. Not but 2 or 3 minutes later after I'd passed, the digging sound stopped, which only served to feed my unease. As much as I tried to keep a level head, I was already starting to panic. And just when I was ready to turn in the other direction, I found a large campsite that sent a shiver down my spine. There was one tent big enough to act as a small house. All around the camp were several axes, hammers, knives, and even a few guns. Multiple sealed crates and barrels littered the center. Off into the trees were 3 pickups with a thick layer of dead leaves, suggesting they had at least been sitting there since last fall, 6 months ago at that point. On the left side of the tent hung 4 deer carcasses that had already been skinned, bled, and dehorned, their antlers piled up on the side. If I had just a little bit longer to look, I'm sure I would have found worse, but almost as soon as I paused to take the place in, I heard the rapid crunching of leaves and branches snapping to my left. As I reeled back in shock, I saw the same figure from before, but much closer. They were stepping quickly towards me. I could now see he was a gargantuan man, clean-shaven, holding a shovel in his left hand, and what looked to be a blood-covered axe in the other. His gait as he trampled bushes and small trees in my direction I could only describe as a Jason Voorhees walk. The blood drained from my face and my stomach dropped to my feet as my legs seemed to start running without me telling them to. I slipped in a small mud puddle and briefly fell to the ground before bolting back the way I'd come, but I'd only run about 6 seconds before a gunshot rang out and a bullet whizzed past my head, blowing out my left eardrum and shattering a nearby tree in 2 splinters. I grabbed my ear reflexively, in pain, and ducked down, trying to take cover while sprinting. Another shot rang out, hitting the branches just above me. 3 more shots would ring out as I put as much distance behind me as I could, but the shots hit further and further away, as if he was hoping a stray bullet would catch me. When I passed the barbed wire fence, I looked back to see if he was following me. No movement, no noise, but I wasn't taking chances. I ran to the ranger's station, and I made it, drenched in sweat and hyperventilating. I told the rangers on duty what had happened to me. They gave me some water, told me to rest, and called in a nurse to check on my ear while they called the police. After several long hours of answering questions and waiting for results, the police returned and said the camp had been torn down and abandoned, with nothing left but tent stakes, rifle casings, various animal parts, and 2 of the 3 pickup trucks. I would later learn from the detective that those trucks had belonged to 2 locals who had gone missing long before. It's been 3 years since then. I no longer have nightmares about the man, but the sound of a shovel still gives me chills. I've got a few guesses to what he was digging up or burying, and I can't help but wonder if something happened that day that I could have prevented. Then again, maybe I should just be grateful that
This happened to me and my now wife when we were on our first date. It was at my parents' house, which is located near a beach, and the sea goes into a stream that runs next to the house into a lake. There are sharks in the stream but somehow never in the lake. On this particular night, I found out that my father was right and why there were no sharks in that lake. It was a warm autumn day when we all heard a car door slam shut. I peeked through the blinds and saw that our new neighbors had arrived. 14-year-old me ran downstairs, of course, to peek out the front door window to look at the new neighbors. First I saw a big muscular man followed by a woman that seemed the same age as the man. But then out of the car came a gorgeous blonde girl my age. I couldn't stop gazing at her until a shout startled me and made my heart nearly beat out of my chest. "Glad I finally got your attention?" I heard my mom say. She then looked out the window and then said, "Oh, I see. She's very pretty, isn't she?" My face turned red and I just stuttered. I'm going to go to the bathhouse to clean up the boat. So I walked over to the boathouse where my dad has this big boat stalled. I had a small boat with an engine there, but I usually use the oars. Both were hanging in the dry docks. I started to clean my boat. I was well over halfway done when I heard a sweet, gentle, feminine voice say, "Hello." I looked up and saw that gorgeous girl standing in the doorway. My heart beat faster just looking at her. I dropped my scrub that I had been using. She introduced herself softly, "I'm your new neighbor, Sarah." I stumbled to get out a word and all that came out of my mouth was, well, Jack. I'm Jack. Sarah took a step down the stairs leading to the floor of the docks and followed with, "Is that your boat?" To which I immediately replied, "Yeah, it's my own little boat, but sometimes my dad lets me operate his boat when no one's around." She turned her gaze to me and smiled at me, which made me blush. Sarah and I then both heard a woman's voice shouting, "Sarah, where are you? Come on, sweetie, start unpacking already." Sarah looked me straight in the eyes, biting her lip, an expression that transformed into a beautiful smile, after which she said, "I have to go, Jack. See you around." She then slowly walked out of the boathouse and I felt my heart rate finally slow down. Sarah ended up at the same school and the same classes as me, so we started to feel more comfortable around each other. But it was clear to everyone what I felt about her from day one, which only increased with every day we spent together, but we never went on a date until some time later. It was a perfect Friday summer day and our friends during lunch break left me and Sarah alone, but not without my childhood friend Walter whispering in my ear, "Ask her already, you dunce." Sarah looked weird at me, saying, "I didn't do something wrong, did I?" To which I replied to her, "Don't worry, I'm sure they want to leave us alone for now." She lowered her head but I could see her biting her bottom lip. She then looked me in the eyes. I could tell she wanted to say something, but then I just blurted out, "Want to go on a date with me?" Sarah looked a bit startled but quickly after turned red. She just hung her head with a huge smile, saying, "Yes, of course." She then raised her head and said, "But only if you take me out on your boat some night." We both smiled from ear to ear and of course I excitingly said, "You got it." Sarah then kissed me on the cheek, then ran back into the school with a huge smile. The rest of the day we gazed at each other during classes, but when we were in front of my house after school we looked at each other and Sarah said, "So tomorrow night is our date, right?" "Yeah, I can't wait," I said. Sarah replied, "Yeah, same here." We then bid our farewells for the day. After I closed the door I immediately told my parents and I made sure everything was going to be absolutely perfect for our date the next night. Soon the next 24 hours or so passed and it was time for my date with Sarah. I was the most nervous I'd ever been up to that day, but my mom kept reassuring me that it would be all right. A few minutes later the doorbell rang. There Sarah walked through the doorway looking perfect. She wore a red velvet dress, had her blonde hair up, red lipstick on, but then I looked at her feet and noticed she was wearing sneakers still. The same blue, red and turquoise colored sneakers she always wore. "Do you like the dress?" I heard Sarah ask gently, but with a ton of insecurity in her voice, and I could only get myself to say, "Perfect." Sarah blushed. "So you two just go ahead and have fun, okay?" was all my mom said, but my level-headed dad only whispered in my ear, "You do know this is just a formality between you two, right?" I gently tapped him in the chest, to which my dad laughed a little, and Sarah and I went to the boathouse. We got out onto the boat and went a bit into the stream. Sarah and I fished in the night, which got darker, but it did present us with a beautiful sunset. Sarah and I hugged each other during it, but we knew our parents were keeping an eye on us. We kept talking until we saw the lights in our parents' rooms go out. I lowered the engine into the water and we went into the lake. Once we hit the lake and I had thrown the anchor in, Sarah stood up and said, "Close your eyes." I looked at her weirdly, which she clearly noticed. She then blurted out, "Hey, just do it, okay?" I closed my eyes and Sarah said, "Okay, now only open them when I say it's okay." After a while I heard a splash and then I heard Sarah speak again, "You can open your eyes." After I opened them, I couldn't see her in the boat anymore, but I did see her dress on the floor of the boat. After searching a few seconds, I saw her head pop up out of the water. "What are you doing, Sarah? You don't know what animals are down there." To which Sarah giggled and replied, "I'm the best in the swimming team, remember?" I stood up and Sarah said, "So, you coming in as well?" I quickly looked around and for a brief moment in the distance, I saw what appeared to be someone's head just breaking the water, so I just told her, "Well, it looks like we aren't the only ones out here." Sarah smiled and replied, "I'm sure they don't mind us having our date here." I walked over to the edge of my boat and leaned over. Sarah and I gave each other our first kiss. After the kiss, we looked into each other's eyes, but before we could say anything else, something pulled Sarah underwater. She came up a second later, grabbing the edge of the boat and asking, "What was that?" Before I could even speak, she was pulled under again, but this time for a few seconds longer. I tried to grab her hand, but I could not find it underwater. Then suddenly, Sarah came out of the water right in front of me. She was desperately trying to catch her breath. I immediately grabbed her hands, and I could see the terror on her face as she begged me to pull her in, but before she was wasted up out of the water, she was violently being pulled back under, and I heard her scream in pain until her head went underwater again. But this time I held on to her, desperately, yet no matter how hard I pulled to get her back up, it wasn't enough to bring her above water again. I began to look around frantically for the other person I thought I saw earlier, but they were nowhere to be found. Then a very painful feeling erupted in my left hand. Out of instinct, I let go of Sarah's hand. Before I realized what I'd just done, I began to frantically put my hands back in the water, hoping to feel the hand of Sarah and to get her to safety, but then, luckily, Sarah came out of the water again, but before she could catch her breath, I swear I saw a hand go over her head and pull her down under again. Luckily, I was able to grab Sarah's hand this time. I made a promise to myself that I would not let go of her. I had a hold of one of her arms, and I could feel her soft hand trying to grab for mine. Once again, I could not pull her out of that water. Something was violently scratching my hands, but no matter how much it hurt, I wasn't going to let go of her this time. I began to feel the muscles in Sarah's arm going limp. With one last burst of energy, I managed to yank her out of the water. I pulled her over the edge of the boat, and I noticed she wasn't moving. Before I could even remember how to do CPR, the boat was being rocked by something in the water. Huge fins were slamming violently at the boat. I put the engine in the water, and I went as fast as I could go. I made it to the edge of the lake, near the stream start, then I looked back toward the water. I saw a head rising from the surface, and I swear I heard a voice, sharp and feminine. No sooner had I heard that, I put the engine back in the water and made my way to the boathouse. The moment I was there, I started CPR on Sarah. Adrenaline and panic surged, and I hoped she wasn't dead. I kept going and going until I noticed Sarah was moving again. She began to spit up water. I then turned her over onto her side, so that the water could leave her mouth. It was then that I noticed her entire body was covered in scratches and bruises, but I was just so happy she was alive. When she was able to move better, I grabbed her dress, which she put on. She stood up to walk, but she was walking as if she had just learned how, so I supported her. She kissed me on the cheek, saying afterward, "Thank you." Maybe it was just the moment, but I blurted out, "Well, I love you, so." When I opened the door to the house, she said she was going to spend the night with me, no matter what. As we lay in my bed, she held onto me tightly, and we eventually fell asleep. I didn't sleep much. I was kind of scared she might slip away again. In the morning, when we came downstairs together, my parents noticed her cuts and bruises right away, and my mom demanded to know what in the world happened. Later, I looked at each other, then Sarah said, "Just a rough night." "What did you do to her?" My mom interrogated me, but Sarah let her know it was not me. For the next 6 months or so, Sarah had a lot of trouble going into the water again. She nearly lost her position on the swim team. Even still, she doesn't go swimming in open water, and I don't think she ever will. I have a scar on my left hand between my middle finger and index finger, as a reminder of that night. But the two of us, we're okay. We're happily married, with a little bit of aquaphobia.
You may have heard a story by Brett about a demon at Lake Park. Well, I live in that same small town. He and I are actually cousins. He's a year older than me, and we've been friends since we were both small. We've always been mesmerized by ghost hunting and hunting for the paranormal, camping in the deepest, darkest woods we can find and listening to and telling scary stories. After he told his encounter at the park, I was so excited, exclaiming that we needed to go investigate. other than some strange noises and a feeling of unease, we found nothing credible. We've gone out there periodically for months, and it never truly showed itself since his experience, and I've never truly seen it. I believed him, but I also thought that maybe they were all exaggerating a small bit. I no longer think that my experience happened a few days ago, as I'm writing this on March 14th. I had just turned 17 a few days before that. I was spending my night riding around with close friends. Tommy from the original encounter was with me, along with another friend named Jared. We had been riding around for hours at that point, and somewhat avoided the park upon Tommy's request for family reasons. However, after some negotiating, he finally agreed, but said that he wouldn't look in its direction. Tommy was in the front and Jared was in the back of my blue Chevy, and we headed out to the park. Jared was more of a skeptic than me and Tommy, so he didn't pay much attention. With the music playing and me and Tommy in the middle of a conversation, we made our way down that dark road. We soon saw the light poles through the trees, which prompted Tommy to pull up his hood and look at his phone. I simply grinned and rolled my eyes at him as we slowly drove by the park. I rolled down my window and put my truck in park. I waited to see if anything would happen. We sat there for 5 minutes or so. I was the only one paying attention. After a while, I began to put my truck into drive again. But then I took another look and I froze. There, sticking out from behind a tall tree, was an unusually tall shadow. It was slightly illuminated by the light pole. I stared at this thing for a good 30 seconds before I saw it shift. It was looking as if it was going to start moving towards me. I slammed on my gas and screamed to heck with that. I floored it to the lake that was just over the hill. I sat there in the parking lot of the lake, attempting to catch my breath. Suddenly, Tommy sat forward and asked me, "You saw it, didn't you? That's the first time you've seen it." Man, I don't want to sit here if you did. We're way too close to that park. He was right. We were maybe 300 yards from the park, but we had a problem to get back to town. We had to drive right back by the park. Yeah, I guess you're right. I said to him. I took a deep breath and prepared to drive by it. Tommy already had his head down, and Jared had AirPods and paying zero attention to what was going on. As we made our way down that hill, the park came into view and my heart sank. There, standing in the middle of the light, was the figure. I had a good view of it now. It looked tall before, but now I could tell it was at least 8 feet tall with disturbingly long arms. But the most horrifying thing was its eyes, deep in less pools of red, staring right at me. I heard no voices or screams. I simply yelled a curse and flew down that old road full of potholes. I didn't slow down until we reached a stop sign. There I stayed put, trying to catch my breath again. I told Tommy and Jared I was ready to go home. They agreed and said that if I needed them to let them know. It was a short drive to everyone's houses, and I finally headed for my place. After that, when I got in, it was around 11:30. No one was awake, so I simply walked to my room. I said a quick prayer and tried to fall asleep. After a few hours of jumping at every little sound, tossing and turning all night, I finally fell asleep. When I awoke the next morning, I felt a strong burning sensation on my left thigh. I quickly rushed to my bathroom to see what it was. I nearly threw up on my thigh. There were 3 paper-thin scratches. It may have been scratches, but it felt as if someone had taken a knife to my leg. For lack of a better word, I was terrified, wondering to myself if that thing followed me home. Nothing has happened since then. I've only driven by that park once. I plan to go back to see if I can get any kind of hard evidence, but it's going to take a little bit to work up that courage. I'll keep you posted. Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to stay safe out there, because this world is full of strange and terrifying things. If you like and enjoyed these stories, then hit the like button, press the notification bell, and subscribe for more spine-tingling content, and we will see you in the next story.